Hi guys, so today we're here with Steve. Hi Steve, how are you?
Hi.
So thank you for joining us today. We just want to kind of pick your brain a little, ask you some questions about your path to being a PhD student here at FIU. So we do know that you did a master's beforehand, right? So can you just tell us a little bit about your journey through from like undergrad to where you are now?
So my journey probably would be more unorthodox than a lot of people. Having a long career in undergrad, trying to figure out what I wanted to do, moving between universities, um, not really knowing what I was doing. My first year in school, I actually started at Georgia Tech, and I didn't feel like what I was studying at the time, architecture, was something I felt like I wanted to keep pursuing, and it was really difficult for me. I didn't feel prepared to be in such a rigorous school. So I actually moved to community college for a few years, which I know is common for a lot of people these days too. Um, Actually outside DC, and I ultimately went back to Pittsburgh where I grew up. Um, for my earlier part of life, and I finished undergrad there. It took me a little bit longer, because my credits didn't transfer. Um, and I think the experience I had, I didn't know I wanted to be into research until I finished until about the end, I think, of my career in undergrad. I did some research in cognitive psychology. I didn't think it was for me. Um, but as I got more into mental health and learned about the opportunities there, I got more curious about it. And I originally started my master's um, as a way of exploring that area, knowing that I wasn't really going to get research experience there, um, because I did my master's in counseling. But as a way, as somebody with not a very competitive GPA for a PhD in psychology program, to step into that world. And there are ways to pursue a master's, and then a PhD in that area as well, which I can talk about too. It's a little bit harder because there are fewer positions, and um, the focus is a little bit different than what you would be doing in clinical psychology. Um, but I did my master's. I moved between full-time and part-time while working as a full-time research assistant or coordinator. And I bounced around a lot more than most people, I think. Um, for a while before applying once for one round to a PhD program, not getting in, and applying again a second round and getting in, and then landing into a program that I thought was a good fit for me. And that's here at FAU. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty unorthodox from architecture to clinical psych. It's a
Yeah.
bit of a pivot, I guess I would say. And I know you said that like your undergrad did take you a little bit longer. Like how long would you say it took you to get from like start to finish, especially with like changing schools twice at that point?
Yeah, I think it took about 6 years, and that's not including maybe like a year break I took. Because
Okay.
I had a really bad concussion actually too during undergrad.
Oh,
That took me out of school for a little bit. So different barriers that came up during undergrad. But I think ultimately I learned from those experiences, and those are some of the things that made me really want to pursue a career in mental health and research in mental health too.
okay. So like those personal experiences that you had, that you're like,
Yeah.
okay, this is kind of the space for me. I feel like a lot of that, especially with like clinical, you kind of get inspired from your own personal life
Yeah.
to end up where you are. When did you start kind of preparing to go to grad school? I know like you initially went the master's route, and then
Mhm.
after that you went into a PhD program. So
Mhm.
I guess like how did that process work?
I knew I wanted to go into a PhD program. I think leaving undergrad, I was not prepared to know how difficult it was going to be. Um, I think entering the master's and going through with that, a lot of people in my program talked about wanting to get a PhD, wanting to move forward into that area, but didn't really have an interest in research, which we can talk about. I mean, I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later too. Why that if you don't want to do research, it might not be the best idea. to do a PhD. Actually, it is not the best idea. If you
Yeah.
absolutely are sure you don't want to do research. But I think I talked to mentors during that time, and they realized like I really had this penchant for research and that I really wanted to keep doing it. So I would say around my last half year in the program, I started really um, feeling like I had the pieces together in terms of enough research experience, um, which um, that is something I think we're also going to touch on regarding gap years, whether that's necessary or not. I think it depends on how much you've prepared during your bachelor's too. And I think there's several different steps in terms of preparing, depending on what question you're asking, because there are different things that you need to prepare for, in terms of getting your CV ready, making sure you have the experiences you need, getting those letters of rec, deciding if you want to take the GRE or not take the GRE, depending on which schools you're looking at. Um,
Hmm.
there's a lot of different parts to that, and it's a lot to do at one time. So building out that path is important, and really knowing what the steps are um is a lot. It can be daunting.
But I kind of like that you kind of have what is it? A different path than like Alyssa took, right? Because we know Alyssa, not even a summer for break. She went straight into her
Mhm.
master's. And then it's like interesting that, you kind of took your time, you had to pivot again, from something else. And then you got your master's and then you applied for a PhD after that,
Yes.
right? So you've been in school for a while. Like, do you feel, how do I phrase this? Like it was a good thing that you did the master's and then you applied for the PhD, or do you think like in a perfect world you would have realized earlier that you wanted to do research?
Um, I don't know. I feel like you need to come to that decision when you're right, when you're at that point,
Okay.
um, to know what you want to do. I think things worked out for me the way that they were supposed to. A lot of people, I think, in my position who've taken a long time feel like they want to enter the workforce and they don't want to, or they're too old to like start this program, which are people older than me who do. But I'm like definitely the oldest in my cohort. I know I'm not the oldest to
Hmm.
start at FIU in the PhD program for sure. But in my cohort I am. Um, I think some people really they know what they want to do. Like Nathan, my friend who was is on internship right now in our lab, like really knew he wanted to do research. I think his challenge was finding out like what population, what questions he had. Like and I know he also kind of sometimes regretted not taking more time to know exactly what he wanted to do.
Mm,
Because he jumped right into the program. Um but I think it worked out for him too. Like he found his own path and he grew a lot in the program. And figured out like he's working in the military now. He's not working with children, even though FIU is a mainly like it's like a children like psychology program.
yeah.
Yeah. And he found a way to make that path work for him. Like in this program, he might have landed, and if he knew what he wanted to do earlier, he might have went into a different program that could have like streamlined him in that experience to get him the skills he wanted there. But I think we all kind of pivot and find a way at some point. The majority of us, I feel like very few people know exactly what they want to do, and then like hit all those milestones like one after the other, like perfectly.
Yeah.
Because I think once you have those experiences, they influence what you're interested in. And sometimes you don't know until you're in that area what you want to do.
Yeah, that's actually something I've heard before, right? Like you have to kind of do the research to figure out whether you like doing the research, even if
Yeah.
it's like research in general or the topic. So I kind of get what you're saying in that regard. Like you kind of have to go through the experience to figure out where you're gonna go from there. You don't just have everything fall
Um,
into place. And what would you say the difference was between, applying for a master's and a PhD? I know like obviously a PhD is a little bit more rigorous since it has a way lower acceptance rate and you're also like a student
yeah.
and an employee at the same time versus a master's. But what was that experience like for you?
The application process. I think for PhDs is more extensive, and I think it's changed a lot since COVID. Between master's and PhD, I think is skewed for me particularly because of how different this post-COVID application process
Mhm.
can be for PhDs. Um, for my master's, I had one interview, and that was it. For PhDs, typically there's a whole day of interviews, and then even between that, programs vary.
Yeah.
Where you might meet with the lab you're applying for, you might not. Um, you might be, and I don't have this experience where, well, I do have the experience where I was applying for two mentors, but I really, I know some people are when like 50-50 split within the same department. Um, and I think they have a little bit of a different interview experience where they're 50% their one mentor and 50% of their another mentor, which is um I think not common at FIU. The application process besides that, similar. I think the master's programs are just a little bit, there's less interviews. Um, and I think that's the biggest difference. But I think in terms of getting materials ready and applying, it's about the same. And obviously for PhD programs, they want to see more research experience. So you're going to put that in your application. Where in masters, they, depending if they're counseling, there are terminal psychology masters where they you do research, and the goal of those programs are really to build you up if you don't have a good GPA or a good research experience before to get in there,
Mhm.
but there's not too much you can do with that degree if you're not going into a PhD program afterwards. So I think I know one person who's done that. Um, I think that she was at Eastern Michigan for their
Okay.
master's program in psychology in particular. There's so many different masters in psychology and counseling that it's hard to really say what's the best option. Um, but if you're gonna do treatment, I mean, definitely counseling is probably the way you want to go. And if you want to get into a PhD program, counseling might not be the most helpful unless you're able to get research experience outside that degree.
Mhm.
Unless you want to do something like a PsyD or a counseling PhD, which is a different um focus. It's not, it's working, that would be more working with um kind of broader questions than you would like in clinical psychology, than working with just a clinical population.
Yeah, because I know counseling would not just be for people with psychopathology,
Yeah.
right? It would be just the general population.
Yeah. But even in
Okay.
counseling, yeah. And even in counseling programs, they have specific focuses. So like in my program, there used to be more, it shifted over time, more of a rehab focus, which is more of a
Mhm.
disability counseling focus, and it became more mental health focused later. And that was mainly, that was a lot had to do with KCREP accreditation, which is the governing body of counseling programs, um, requiring more and more things. And both APA and KCREP have made programs much longer than they used to be. So most counseling programs are more than 2 years now, and most PhDs are more than 5 years for a lot of people.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't know that everything's getting longer.
Yeah.
Okay. So people who are going into PhDs, like who are applying this cycle or next cycle, specifically for counseling, PhD or master's, should expect to spend even more than 2 years or more than five. Wow. So I know you did say like you applied twice for PhD programs. So around how many did you apply for each time? And I guess what did you do differently the second time to like get into like FIU's program?
Between those times, a few things I think that happened were I got better at writing my personal statement, and I
Mhm.
had a much stronger personal statement the second time. Um, and I had a better idea of what people were looking for from going through that first time. Um, I also had more research experience and I had a publication in the works, and I had advocated to start a publication in my lab, and really pushed for getting on projects, which I think is important if you really want to get to grad school. And you have to in psychology or in research, you really need to push to get posters or publications and show that you an interest in that area, even if you're like going straight from undergrad. Um, Other things is I think my like letters of recommendation were stronger because people knew me better from when they
Mm,
wrote my first letter of recommendation. And then I had a different person help with the second one that I had built a stronger relationship with. And I think that made a big difference as well. So I think those two elements did. And so a little bit more research experience, stronger letters of recommendation, and stronger personal statement. Um, and tailoring those personal, like preparing more ahead of time to tailor those personal statements to the labs. And I think I applied to labs that were better fits for the experience I had too. Um, so in terms of the number of labs I applied to, I narrowed it down to maybe like 12 or 15 the first time and second time, and then I only applied to 9, and I applied in the order that my preference was in, and
mhm.
used the time I had. And I didn't have enough time to apply to all of them because you really don't want to apply to so many that you don't have enough time to personalize your applications to those places because you're going to be really competitive no matter where you apply. So you really need to make sure your application is targeted because if it looks generic, people can tell that and they're not going to give you the same weight as a lot of other people. Um, And I think that probably was the strongest part of my application, how personalized my personal letters were, my personal statements were. And you don't want to apply to places you don't want to go to just to hit a number somebody told you that you need to hit. Like people, like you need to apply to a decent number of places, yeah. But if you don't want to go there, like there's no point in applying, unless you really feel like you can be happy at that backup or get the skills. I mean, even being happy, like get the skills you need to do what you want to do.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially the applications, they're a little expensive. You don't want to pay
Yeah,
$70 to apply to school that you're gonna reject.
yeah.
But I love how you touched on the CV, right? Um, and like the research experience there, getting experience that's more specific to the labs like you want to work in. So and I'm not sure if you would know the answer to this, right? So is it that like the quality of the research experience, like it matching with what the professor does is more important than just having research experience in general? Even if, let's say it is clinical, is it better to specialize in research that like the professor that you want to be your advisor specializes in?
It's gonna help you more than just having general. I mean, if you can, and I mean, you have to pitch it as something that you like. If you don't like what you're doing, I mean, then you want to go into a different field and you need to find a way to pitch. You need to make sure that your research experience fits for what lab you're going into. Because you have to also you need to realize you're not only applying to school, but you're applying for a job position too in
Mm,
that lab, and you're going to be working in that lab and having experiences that put you in experience in a position where you're going to be able to already hit the ground running a little bit with some of the things you'll be doing already makes you more attractive than somebody who doesn't have those experiences. And a lot of that stuff you will get as a general research assistant. Um, but sometimes those are things that you won't get. Um, and programs, most of them, the PI is the one making the decision, and there's no universal format for what they will put weight to. Some people might care more about grades. Some people might care more about your research experience. Some people might have like a program might say we have no specific GRE, but that professor might say, well, I have a cutoff for myself. Um,
mm.
so those are things that are outside your control. Um, but these are what I'm talking about are things that will help in general. Yeah.
Okay. And with the personal statement, right? How you said like you kind of were able to tailor it better the second time around. And then that's something also that should be tailored to the lab you want to work with and the program you're applying for. What
Mhm.
tips, like other than like what general tips should you give? What should be in your personal statement? How should you format it? Things like that.
Oh man, that's hard because they'll give you different word limits for each school. Um, Two, you want to say. why you want to study there specifically. That's the most important thing. What the program has to offer, what the mentors there have to offer that you're looking for, and why you are the best person to work with those people or answer those questions at that place. There is going to always be a focus on treatment, and everyone's going to be interested in treatment. So you want to say a little bit about what your motivation is there, but you also want to touch on the research.
Mhm.
Unless you're applying to, I mean, for masters it's different. You want to touch on why you want to do clinical work. But for a PhD program, you want to touch in like why the skills there will help you. Like you want to emphasize fit, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. Um, Typically you want to talk about one or two people you want to work with um in the program. If there's only one person, you really want to hammer in like what this is the person I want to work with. Um, and this is why. You always want to start with what your motivation was and why you want to be doing this type of work, and then why you're the best fit for that program, and then why who you want to work with and why. And there's a lot of different ways to say that and do that. Um, and you want to come off as not generic.
Okay. Yeah. So like
And make
personalize
sure you
that.
have this, yeah, and make sure you have the correct university in
Oh,
your personal statement. As I read on like Reddit, people who've had like the wrong universities. I think one person actually got in and like the professor wrote like, oh, this is funny, you left this in. But because everything else was right and they had just forgot
yeah.
to like change the university's name at the beginning. But typically I think that's not a great look.
Yeah. And not everyone's gonna have that sense of humor.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, definitely proofreading your personal statement, making sure it says the right names because, if
Mm,
you say, thank you, I want to go to UF to FIU professor, they might just forward that on to UF and not read it.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, so like I guess on the topic of professors you want to work with, how did you go about the process of reaching out to professors? And did you also reach out to any like graduate students before you would like apply to a school?
I did not reach out to graduate students first. I reached out to professors, definitely. And I just scoured through like US news of like top PhD programs and just went through each website and looked at each researcher and what they were doing. Um, and it was a lot of work. So a lot of spreadsheets of just like the name of the professor, what their focus is, and then just like crossing people out, moving people around, deciding what the order was.
Mhm.
Uh,
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
spreadsheets help a lot as you're going through different labs. I would just like start making a spreadsheet of people you want to work with, like have their focus. Sometimes it's hard to know what's going on in a lab currently because people pivot from what their old research was too. So that's
Mm.
why it's a good idea to email people. And Dana, I know like her past research in depression is not what she's doing right now, which is what I was reading most about. Um, and she hosted like a virtual open house, which sometimes a lot of places do that too, where they will have like a virtual open house or something like that, um, for labs. But a lot of that's on Twitter, which is a weird world to be in right now. So it's hard to find. Yeah, I think your best like bet is like really just going online, just like looking um at university after university after university. Like start like where you if you like know you want to be in Florida, I mean just find the top places there. For PhDs in clinical psychology, you're gonna have a lot more luck if you like broadly apply. And the best programs are gonna be still like East Coast, West Coast.
Mhm.
Um,
There was this like podcast I was listening to that said like the best time to start. prepping your graduate application specifically for PhDs is a year before, right? So like in your junior year,
Hmm.
if you want to apply in senior year. So I just thought that was like kind of crazy because nobody really tells you that. And that's, but like from hearing what you're saying, especially if you're personalizing each application, you have to like, yes, you write your personal statement, but then you have to kind of rewrite it a little bit for this program and this program and this program. Like, and then if you're applying to like, you apply to nine, like that's, or well, you had your short list of nine, but still like if you want to apply to all nine, you have to start really early to do those
Hmm.
edits. That's definitely a lot of work. Well, could you actually give a rundown of what a CV is for anyone who might not know? Right? Because I know for me, that was one thing I kept hearing it. I was like, what is that? Like, how is that different from a resume? Could you tell us a bit about that?
There's a couple different ways that you can set it up. I actually have mine open here.
And just a fun fact, Steve actually helped me with mine so that way I can
Mhm.
apply for a job. So they're the right person to ask this question to because yeah,
Period.
they literally made edits to mine, what to add, what not
Mhm.
to add. So yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so for PhD programs, what do you want to do? I mean, you have your education first, always. A CV is like just a list of your experience and accomplishments. Curriculum yeah, curriculum vitae. Um, like your resume, you want to have your like contact information on top. You want your education, and then you list things more than like some like you do on a resume too, but you have unlimited space. On mine, I have positions, so like employment I had, and like really focusing on like research, labs I had worked on, and then clinical practice, things I've worked in, like volunteer work I did for like a therapeutic camp. Like it was a lot like STP that I worked in Pittsburgh. Um, and then some like mindfulness courses that I taught like in public schools. Um, and then you have certificates and licensures, professional memberships. Like you should be part of APA or ACA, and just have that on there. I think I need to actually renew my membership, but that's typically like an easy thing to stay on and stay present with, and people look for that to know if you're staying up to date with things. Honors and awards, you want to put on like if you were cum laude, summa cum laude, whatever you were. I got a research grant that was a diversity supplement that I put on there when I was in my master's. And then I have like my papers, my poster presentations, and my talks, and then some professional and technical skills. Um, for most people, um, having a few papers on is very helpful,
Mhm.
and making sure you have those opportunities is very helpful. A lot of people have a first author publication in like some very low impact journal, and I can explain what that means, which means that it's not a journal many people read. But it still shows that you put like some effort in there, which is something you can work with. And like if you're working in a lab, like talking to mentors about that. And that's something I definitely had. If you're in the process of publishing something, which happens a lot, you can have that on definitely your CV on your application to grad school to know that you're just doing work. I would just say make sure in your letters of recommendation that the people who are helping you on that paper back that up. Um,
Okay.
too. So they know you're actually working on that stuff too. But yeah, so short and sweet. One thing that's missing from mine as I'm lifting this off is public service, which is definitely, I think, a weakness I have in like my CV right now, which is hard to have time to do this in grad school. But in undergrad, if you have service, if you volunteer, if you do stuff like that, that should definitely be in there too. Um,
Okay. Thank you for the rundown. Because a lot of the people need it. I guess it feels like a really like a different world, honestly, getting into that, CV. You're no longer just putting, oh, these are the most pertinent things. Like you're kind of putting everything on there.
yeah.
But yeah, no, I hear you on the public service. Um, one thing my mentor had told me was like community engagement, right? Even if it was like a job that you did, instead of listing it as just like, oh, I work this, like this is, you know, a way that I give back to the community as well.
Yeah.
It's something to throw in there. But since you know you helped Alyssa with her CV, how's that CV looking, Alyssa?
It looks pretty good. I mean, I had to make a couple more edits because obviously Steve was like, no, you need to make edits here, you need to make edits there. So I had to make a couple more edits, but I also had references from other CVs because obviously me and Steve don't work in the same like department or program. So I had to ask people in my program and department, like, hey, help me out here. I need to create one. So based off that, I put everything together and they kind of like just did an overview of my CV, made a couple edits, told me to make a couple edits. So I made that and now my CV is sent to another program so that I can, well, or I applied or they're going to talk to somebody so I can apply if the position is available.
Okay, awesome. Come on, Miss CV Queen. Okay, so Alyssa, when you were applying for your master's, did you apply with a resume or, and is this your first CV?
Yeah, so I actually applied with a resume because all the jobs that I've had in the past always required resumes. And also I think they give like either or like a CV or resume, which I think
Hmm.
most programs offer, but I think as Steve is saying, like PhDs require more of a CV than a resume because obviously they're looking for more information on what you've done in your time to kind of help you stand out versus like a master's it's just like a resume of like all the jobs you've been part of and like if those jobs have been more of the clinical work then great. But yeah, I've always done resumes, and that's kind of also another thing that helped me with my CV. I already had my resume set up. So I just kind of plugged in a lot of the things that were on my resume. But yeah, my program is a little different. So it's the similar program to what Steve did for their master's. But actually their master's was like one whole track, like clinical, rehab, and school, versus mine is 3 different tracks. So it's the clinical mental health counseling track, the rehab track, and the school counseling track. I did, but now it's majors, sorry, not tracks. When I went in, it was a track, but now it's a major. But I went in for the clinical mental health counseling major for the counselor education program. So all I had to do was pretty much write a personal statement, send my resume, get 3 letters of recommendation, which mine were because I was a research assistant here at Mint. I got Dr. Jonathan Comer's recommendation letter, and then I got 2 other people. One was from the cheerleading program that I was coaching at. I got the owner's letter of recommendation as well as a professor here. At FIU, so I got those 3. And then after they told me like, oh, we think you're like a great fit, but before even interviewing you, you have to go through a series of steps. So one of the steps was that I had to be on a Zoom call with many different people, and I think they still do this on Zoom. They don't do this in person. And what I had to do was, I don't know what it's called, but it's a certain test or like a certain type of thing to determine where, I think where your mind is at or like where you feel, I don't know. It was a weird thing because I even after was like, that was just weird. But honestly, I feel like it's helpful as well. So the prompt was I have to determine who or like between 5 different people who should get a transplant, and I'm not going to say what, but a transplant. And out of those 5 people, it's like one person's a convict, one person's a cult leader, one person's this, whom. Thank you very much. Whom? Ross Geller from Friends out here. It's like whom should get a transplant, but I don't think that's the right word now, or who should get a transplant, whether it's a convict, a little boy, a prostitute or whatever, and like you have to kind of write out why you feel these people should get the transplant and all that. So obviously I went through that process and I made it through to the next and final round, which is the interviews. I did an interview with 3 of the directors of the program. So the director of the mental health counseling program, the director of the clinical, like more of like the clinical hours, or like our clinical director, and then the director of our program. I was so nervous. I thought I bombed that interview. I literally asked a super personal question that I probably shouldn't have asked. And luckily now me and the person that I asked that personal question to, me and her are cool. Shout out to Dr. P. But yeah, she, like, I asked her a very personal question. She was like, that's very personal, but we'll talk about it in class. And I was like, okay, me and her super close now. She is actually my advisor for my program. So I'm like, okay, great. And then I got an email from the director saying like, you got accepted. And that was a whole process. So I applied in March and I didn't know I got accepted until May. So that's how long more? 2 months, and I was dying. So yeah.
And then for Steve, I know with PhD, you send in the initial application, usually December, and it's usually, from what I hear, it's usually like April, May, you find out if you've gotten in. Yes, that's,
Yes,
oh,
and you know if you got invited for interviews, then you know. I mean, it's really hard now because like there was even a case where I received an email where they said we've done interviews, but I'll let you know you're on my short list because I'm not sure if we're gonna do a second round.
mm,
But sometimes universities do that if they feel like they aren't impressed, I guess, with the first round of interviews they did, or they invited a few people when they feel like both of them wouldn't pan out. So there can be additional rounds. Weird stuff can happen. Going back to Nathan, Nathan didn't apply for Dana's lab, but Dana didn't like any other applicants she had other than Logan, who's the other student on internship right now. So she dipped into Raul Gonzalez's applications because she does a little bit of similar work, and found his application and asked to do an interview with him
mm.
after the main interview because Raul said he wouldn't take him. So I guess Dana asked a few people if they had applicants they thought were strong. Um, but she didn't personally get the interview, so that's how he got in. Um, so it's a lot of steps because first you're excited you're accepted for an interview, but then you don't know if you'll make it through the interview. Um, it's a very traumatizing experience, actually. Um, it's very difficult. You need to be very used to rejection. I'm not used to it, but you need to be very good with rejection, which I take things hard, but I think persevering through things is maybe what has helped me a lot too. Because I think it has been a little bit because of my unorthodox pathway, it was maybe a little bit difficult for me. Um, More difficult for me to stand out.
Mm.
Um, but some people like that. Some people like students who have more experience, some don't. Um, but I think the wait period varies a lot because I did not think I was going to get an interview with FIU because the majority came around the same time before the holidays, the invites, or I got letters that I wasn't invited. And I think it depends where professors are and what time they have to look through applications. Um, because the school has its own deadlines, but
Mhm.
it's the professor might have different deadlines for saying that when they have invites ready. Um, so you expect communication throughout after you apply, starting probably a month later, and then things do not come out at the same rate at all. Um, and then a lot of times you can go online and see like invites have been sent out to from one university Um, However, that doesn't mean that all invites have been sent out
Okay.
at the same time. So it's not necessarily something to forget about, but it's hard. I would stay off the internet and looking at application. I mean, like it's impossible not to, but I would try not to because it's very difficult to know what's actually going on behind the scenes.
Mm.
And you might stress yourself out more than you need to. Um, but yeah, actual invites go out April-ish. No, before, it depends. The absolute deadline, don't quote me on this. You can look it up online. Um, for students to accept universally is April 24th, which
Okay.
means that if students have rejected schools, you might, at that point, you will receive other invites. If you were
Mm.
on the short list of people too. So like there might be X amount of positions, but not every student's going to accept. If they have two or three other schools, they're not going to accept all the positions. You can go online and see for most schools how many invites they sent out and how many people accepted. I think APA requires some of that information to be published. APA also, I think,
Yeah.
requires that GPA, mean GPA be on there from programs, and I think GRE if they accept GRE.
I was actually gonna talk about something that you said that was like the interview process can be nerve-wracking, and I definitely felt that, even though like I bet for like PhD it's a little bit more extensive.
Yeah, for interviews, I would expect at least a day for a PhD. Not that you were talking to your major professor for the entire day, but you have interviews with other professors too. And there's normally several panels or student panels, diversity panels, things of that nature. Um, Most
Nice.
important thing to have during interviews with professors, or interviews in general, is to always make sure you have questions at the end, because there's
Mhm.
nothing more awkward than a professor asking you if you have any more questions and you're like, nah. The questions do like give off that you're interested, you want to know more, you're curious about being in that program.
What questions would you say are good to ask in general, right? Yeah, like I have my go-to for everything. I'm like, what does the day-to-day look like? And then also, I asked this actually for my interview. I was like, what does someone who's successful at this position, like, what do they do? Because I'm like,
Yeah,
those are just, I like to ask those. So what would you say you should ask in like a PhD interview?
I think one of those or two of those is fine. Especially with people who are not your major professor. For your major professor, I would try to have like some questions that also indicate you've done some research about them.
Hmm.
Um, like asking about a specific thing they've worked on before and
Gotcha.
ideas you might have about what it might look like for you, or like asking would I have the opportunity to learn about this in your lab. So for me, I would be like, so I know that you've done neuroimaging, like what opportunities and data do you have like in this lab right now that you're working on, um to work with, like what are my opportunities like with what the project you're working in are right now. One question I asked everyone.
I know Steve, me and you were talking before about like that PhDs also require diversity statements. Is that
Mm.
still like some obvious? Well, obviously we're in Florida, so like I don't know if they still require, but like when you were applying, did you have to create a diversity statement
I think
for
for most
programs?
universities, yeah, I think for most, and those varied a lot
Mm.
from like a paragraph, like a few sentences, to like a full page. That is one definitely where the PI you're applying to matters, because it depends on how much that matters to them too.
Okay.
You
Because there's some
definitely do
PIs
that.
that do not care definitely about diversity and inclusion. I think most
Yeah.
do. I don't know. But it's also hard to know what people are looking for. I mean, in those you want to write about your work with diverse populations more than necessarily. I mean, you can talk about your personal identity too.
Mhm.
Um, but a lot of it's asking questions about what's been your work or experience with diverse populations and why you think it's
Mm.
important. Um, and you can also talk about like how your positionality like helps inform your work as well, or limits like what you know. I don't know. You can also be humble at those and just also say that I'm like really looking forward to Miami because I haven't been able to work with diverse populations before, like
Mm.
where I grew up.
Good one.
Like I've like not had this opportunity. This is something that I'm like hoping to get. I mean, like, it's important to be honest, obviously, but there are ways to spin it, even if you think like, oh, I have nothing to write about. Like I've never worked with diverse populations, so
Yeah. I actually had an RA that had a difficult time writing her diversity statement because, well, I mean, I never needed to write one for my master's. It was just a personal statement and moving on. Or it wasn't actually it's not actually a personal statement, it's an autobiographical sketch. So it's something similar to that, but you're answering legit questions. So like 1, 2, 3, like 1 through 7, and you're answering that question to like your own thing. But for her, she was applying to Nova, and they have a diversity statement, and the diversity statement wasn't like, have you worked with diverse populations or anything like that. It was more like on her identity and like how she like I don't remember the prompt, but it was just about her. And she was like, I don't know what to write. And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, I am literally the majority population. I am a white, Caucasian, Jewish female. And I was like, oh, okay. So I didn't know. I was just like, oh, okay. I mean, you can write about like how even though you're part of this population, like you, how can you help minority populations? Like how would you be able to use theoretical approaches like to those populations, things like that? Because I was just like, I'm not sure. But I was talking with another RA about it the other day, and they had a point. It's like, but technically they're female. They could have wrote that I identify as a female, and like this can be a complicated field because like if I'm going for a PsyD like or a PhD, the majority is males and like so on and so forth. So I was like, oh, that makes sense. I could have told her that, but she got accepted. So regardless of like what I told her, she put whatever, and she got accepted into the PsyD program at Nova. So yeah.
I wonder how that is changing with a lot more females entering the field of clinical
Mm-hmm.
psychology
Mm-hmm.
too. Um, so my cohort, it's 8 females and 2 non-female. So big difference. I don't think there's a male in the current first year cohort.
In the
Wow.
clinical psych program, this or
Mhm.
clinical science program. Interesting. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit that might a little bit be due to it being child focused too, which is traditionally not a field that's attractive to men at all. Um, but I think even if you are from a majority or from a position of privilege, I mean that's something you write about. Um, and you just talk about it in the way that's affected you and what you've noticed about it. Um, and how that is it's gonna impact your clinical work. And you need to talk about that.
Mm.
And I think part of it's if you are is talking about cultural humility.
That's true. Or like a commitment to
Yeah,
cultural competence as well, right? Because even
yeah.
if you're from the majority, if you have personal relationships with a lot of marginalized groups, you can talk about being an ally, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I let her know too, like yes, you may be like that from that population or that community, but technically you live in Miami. You're you're a minority in Miami because there's not many like white, Caucasian, European like families here or like people here because it's all Hispanics from Cuba, Latin America, like everyone is here. Also like African Americans, everyone's here in Miami. So like for her to be like, I don't know, like I'm in the majority, I'm like, I also gave her the idea. I'm like, well, technically you're in Miami. You live in Miami. You can write something like that too, that like you live in a very diverse place and that's helped you grow. And she was like, I don't know. I'm like, okay. I gave her ideas, and at that point I was like, I mean, I can't write the paper for you. Like, now you have to decide. I'll look it over for you after, but now this is up to you. I ultimately don't know what she wrote in the end, but yeah, she got in. So
And I have one last question for the both of y'all, right? That you guys did touch on, but I want to go a little more in depth about those letters of rec. Who do you talk to and how do you talk to them?
like I was saying, I was a research assistant with Mint before being a program coordinator. So I was not, when I was applying to grad school, I was not a program coordinator just yet. I was still a research assistant. So I just emailed the director, Dr. Comer, and I was like, hey, I'm a research assistant with you. Like, I've worked really hard on like XYZ, or like, just kind of talking to him about the things that I've done in the lab. Also explaining to him like I'm a bilingual like RA. I've done phone screens in English and Spanish. Like, is it possible to just kind of talking about the things that I've done in the lab, because obviously some directors don't work so closely with research assistants. You kind of have to talk to them a little bit about what you do on your day to day. So that's what I did. And he was like, yeah, definitely we'll write it. Wrote it up for me, was able to send it off. Because, and then the others, it was just a professor that I knew. And I asked them, like, hey, I've been in your class for this amount of time, or I've done like multiple classes of yours. Are you able to write a letter of recommendation for me? Same thing with the cheerleading coach owner. I cheered when I was younger there, but then I ultimately became a coach for the program, and I was a coach for 3 years. And then I had to take a step back because I wanted to focus more on my research assistant position to get more experience. And then I reached out. I'm like, hey, I was a coach for 3 years. Is it possible for you to write my letter of rec? And she was able to do that for me. And here I am. I'm about to graduate.
Man, for PhD, this is a difficult and very challenging thing for a lot of people. Definitely, people you've done clinical work with is a good way to go. Professor letters, these are probably not that useful, but I think for a lot of people provide padding. Unless you have a close relationship with the professor,
Okay.
and they know what to write about you. Otherwise, it's going to be like the student got an A in my class. They work hard, which is a lot of people. And so if you've gone to office hours a lot and you've like worked with that professor, that's different. I know for med school that's like very common though. Definitely you want whoever is the PI of your lab to write you a letter of recommendation. Sometimes if the PI is very absent, like Alyssa was indicating, that might mean that the coordinator writes the letter and the PI signs off on it. Because if the coordinator knows what work you've been doing and how well you've been doing. Oh yeah, so this is important. When you send in a letter recommendation, you do have the right to view the letter. But you have to click the little box that says you would like to see the letter. It is always advised not to do that, because it comes off as not trusting the professor to write you a good letter recommendation. Because also professors will expect for it to be confidential. Just know that sometimes like PIs will confirm that those are real letters, and reach out to the people who wrote it to make sure, because people have forged like their letters.
People do.
Typically there are safeguards around that because they have to submit it.
Yeah.
But those are things, and those are, and like you also should, like PIs might ask like, what do you want me to say too in this letter? and you need to be prepared and like know what you want them to say. Um, like talk about my work here, that I'm working on this. Sometimes they might ask for your personal statement. The one letter writer asked for my personal statement to, or two of mine, so that they could write their letter in line with my personal statement and like support what was in my personal statement too. So I would even volunteer that too, because I also got feedback on my personal statement that way too. From most times, like if somebody feels like they can't give you a good one, they'll say no. I feel like no one is really going to screw anyone over. Um, just make sure, yeah, it's people that know you pretty well. Um, I know there, not for grad school, but I know there have been cases where people have gotten negative letters of recommendation, um, which is typically does not come off. It doesn't make the person who's writing it look good. So I feel like that is something that you really shouldn't worry about. Um, but make sure you have a good relationship with the person that you got the letter recommendation. So if it's just somebody you know is like the P like a professor or a PI, just make sure that you have a good relationship with that person too.
And so, like in asking for a letter of rec, you should kind of just like email them your CV and not your CV, sorry, your personal. Well, I guess your CV
Your
would help,
CV
but
too. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. So yeah, that and then the personal statement and be like, hey, could you write me a letter of rec?
Yeah.
Actually, one thing I heard is like asking if you can write that, like, can you write me a strong letter of recommendation? Because
Yes,
then,
exactly for that reason.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because that like changes the dynamic, right? Because anyone can write a letter of recommendation, but you don't want just a letter, you want a strong letter.
Yeah. A strong, I would say strong or a positive letter recommendation.
Well,
Mhm.
does anyone have any last thoughts? Those are all my questions.
Okay, applying to a clinical PhD program is very difficult. Um, most programs, except on average, I don't even know. It's probably like 8 to 2% or 10 to 2% of applicants, 10 being very generous. Um, and you're going up against hundreds of people, and you can do absolutely everything right and still not get into a program for a number of reasons, because you weren't the right fit for that place, or the professor that you're applying to decided that they can't accept students that year, or like has happened at FIU, a professor accepts somebody and then leaves into industry or moves to another university. Um, or the funding's not there. Somebody thinks they could take two students, but they can't take two students. Um, you were just not a match for what was going on. Um, it's not necessarily that you are not competitive enough. Um, so a lot of people don't get in the first round. Some people don't get in the second round. Some people and get in on a third round. You can keep trying. You just want to keep on building your skills in between. And if you find you're doing the same thing over and over again and not getting to grad school, um, you need to pivot. And some of it might not be some of it might be your recommendations are not good. You need to ask other people. You're not getting the skills you're applying too broadly, you're not focusing enough. Whatever feedback you can get from people, which is rare to get from people when you have applied, is good, especially if you've had interviews and can get information from them. But you can do everything right and still not get in, and it's not your fault. There's nothing wrong with you.
Isn't that what you said earlier? That things happen how they're meant to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that made grammatical sense. That felt wrong when I said it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just like
Okay.
the whom. Sometimes it's who.
It's for whom when it is the object
It's who sometimes.
sometimes.
Okay. Well, um,
It's
thank you so
references are
much.
gonna
We're
no
getting
one's
into
gonna get the
the grammar
references.
section.
It's a post show section.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve, so much for, coming on and answering the barrage of questions.
Mhm.
That was a lot of really great information, and I hope that our viewers out there, you guys are able to get some really nice tidbits. I learned a lot from everything you guys both said. So, thank you.